April 7, 1942, skies above Port Moresby, New Guinea. The radio crackled with static as Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson transmitted his final message. Words that would haunt surviving pilots of the 8th Fighter Group for months afterward, as they struggled to understand how American P-39 Airacobras, once considered technological marvels, had become aerial coffins in the vast Pacific theatre. He's on my tail. I can't shake him. He turns inside me every time. Johnson's voice faded as his aircraft plummeted into the dense jungle below, the 43rd American pilot lost in just 8 weeks of combat operations. Through bullet-riddled canopies, his wingmen had watched a familiar and terrifying scenario unfold. Their P-39 fighter executing what textbooks claimed was the proper defensive maneuver, a tight horizontal turn, while the nimble Japanese A6M-0 effortlessly carved a tighter arc inside their flight path, guns blazing. The mathematics of aerial defeat were being calculated in real time, not in firepower or engine strength, but in the devastating physics of horizontal turning combat against an aircraft that weighed just 5,313 pounds fully loaded, nearly 3,000 pounds lighter than the American fighters sent to oppose it. While American pilots strained against crushing G-forces that blurred vision and threatened consciousness during maximum performance turns, Japanese pilots in their lighter A6Ms maintained clear sight pictures and precise control. Lieutenant Commander John S. "Jimmy." Thatch stared at the combat reports stacking up on his desk aboard USS Lexington. The veteran Navy pilot had been analyzing accounts from surviving aviators across the Pacific with growing alarm. The data painted an unmistakable picture. American fighters were suffering catastrophic loss ratios approaching 13-1 when engaging in traditional dogfighting tactics against the Zero. At 30, Thatch had already spent 12 years in naval aviation. His analytical mind catalogued the technical specifications confronting American pilots. The Zero's remarkable maneuverability came from its extraordinarily light construction, with a wingspan of 39 feet 4.5 inches, powered by a 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai radial engine generating 950 horsepower. This combination gave it a top speed of 331 mph and, more critically, a turning radius that no American fighter could match. By comparison, the Navy's F-4F Wildcat weighed 7,152 pounds loaded, with a maximum speed of 318 mph. The Army's P-40 tipped the scales at 8,280 pounds, with similar performance limitations. Both American fighters carried self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor that the Zero lacked, critical survivability features that came at the cost of agility in a dogfight. That evening in his cramped stateroom, Thatch cleared his small desk and arranged matchsticks in patterns representing aircraft formations. For hours he manipulated them, thinking through three-dimensional problems in the two-dimensional space available. Junior officers who glimpsed this peculiar behavior through his partially open door assumed combat fatigue had overtaken the respected squadron commander. They couldn't have known they were witnessing the birth of a revolutionary aerial tactic that would transform the air war in the Pacific. Thatch was beginning to understand something profound. Success would require abandoning everything pilots had been taught since the First World War. "We must stop fighting the way the Japanese expect us to fight," Thatch wrote in notes that night. "Traditional horizontal turning engagements guarantee our defeat. We need a tactic that exploits their weaknesses rather than challenging their strengths." The next morning, reviewing performance reports on the Zero, captured from intelligence sources and combat accounts, Thatch identified two potential vulnerabilities. The Zero's light construction made it structurally fragile under high-speed stresses, and its exceptional turning ability came at the cost of roll rate, the speed at which an aircraft could transition from level to inverted flight and back again. These insights would become the foundation of a tactic that even experienced aviators initially rejected as suicidal. When threatened by a pursuing Zero, conventional wisdom dictated turning harder. Thatch was about to prove that sometimes the correct response was to roll upside down and fly directly toward your wingman instead. But first, American pilots would endure months of devastating losses as commanders clung to outdated tactical doctrine from a previous war. The matchsticks on Thatcher's desk represented lives that would be saved, if only he could convince others to believe what his analysis was telling him. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Hawaii. The flames still illuminated the harbour as Lieutenant Commander Thatch reviewed the tactical manuals that had shaped a generation of American fighter pilots. The pages contained dogma that could be traced directly to Captain Edward Eddie Rickenbacker and the aerial knights of the First World War. He who turns tightest wins the fight. This doctrine had been hammered into every naval aviator since the 1920s. The Bureau of Aeronautics' official tactical publication, Fighting Squadron Manual, 1938, explicitly prioritized turning performance above all other fighter characteristics, a carryover from biplanes that dueled at 120 mm. 20 years of peacetime training had calcified these principles into unquestioned orthodoxy. When America's first carrier-based fighter aircraft, the F-2F-1, entered service in 1935, it was evaluated almost exclusively on its ability to execute tight horizontal turns. The same standard applied to the F-3F and later the F-4F Wildcat. Each generation of naval fighter was designed to improve upon the horizontal maneuverability of its predecessor without fundamentally questioning the tactical paradigm. But Japan's naval aviation had evolved differently. The Zero represented the endpoint of a design philosophy that sacrificed everything for maneuverability. Its designer, Jiro Horikoshi, had stripped away redundant systems, armor protection, and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Zero's remarkable wooden wings spanned 39 feet, 4.5 inches, producing exceptional lift despite its modest 950 horsepower Nakajima Sakai engine. This created a fighter that could turn through a complete 360-degree circle in approximately 15.5 seconds, while the American F-4F Wildcat required nearly 20 seconds for the same maneuver. The catastrophic consequences became evident as combat reports filtered back from Wake Island, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. American pilots who entered turning contests with Zeros simply disappeared. The few survivors described the same scenario: initiating a textbook horizontal turn, watching as the Zero effortlessly cut inside their arc, and then desperate attempts to escape as 7.7mm machine gun fire and 20mm cannon shells tore through their aircraft. Aboard USS Lexington in early 1942, Thatch assembled his squadron of 7 experienced pilots. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, who would later earn the Medal of Honor, shook his head as Thatch outlined the performance disparity. "We're bringing a knife to a sword fight," O'Hare muttered, examining intelligence photographs of the Zero's lightweight structure. At 30, Thatch already had 1,800 flight hours and had graduated from the elite Navy fighter weapons course. His analytical approach set him apart from many contemporaries. While other squadron commanders emphasized aggressive spirit, Thatch methodically dissected the problem. He obtained every available combat report, noting patterns in both American losses and the rare successes. The Zero's weaknesses emerged gradually from this analysis. Despite its agility, the Zero's lightweight construction made it vulnerable to even brief bursts of the Wildcat's 650 caliber Browning machine guns. Reports indicated that Zeros avoided high-speed dives due to control stiffening at velocities above 300 knots. And critically, the Zero's exceptional turning performance came at the expense of roll rate, the speed at which an aircraft could transition from level flight to inverted. This last observation became the seed of Thatcher's developing counter-strategy. The F-4F Wildcat, despite its inferior turning radius, could roll from upright to inverted in approximately 1.5 seconds, significantly faster than the Zero's 2.25-second roll rate. As Japanese forces pushed deeper into the Pacific in early 1942, American carrier groups faced increasing pressure. By April, the Imperial Japanese Navy controlled virtually all airspace in the Western Pacific. Kill ratios in some engagements approached 19-1 in Japan's favor. Some senior naval officers questioned whether carrier aviation could survive at all against such overwhelming aerial superiority. "We're asking young pilots to commit suicide with our current tactics," Thatch wrote in a confidential memo to Admiral Nimitz's air staff. "They follow their training perfectly and die perfectly. We must immediately abandon horizontal turning engagements against the Zero." That night in his quarters, Thatch arranged 4 matchsticks on his desktop, mimicking the standard defensive formation American fighters had used since the 1930s. He methodically demonstrated how this formation disintegrated when confronted by turning Zeros. Then he began experimenting with alternatives, moving the matchsticks in patterns that contradicted everything he had been taught. The counterintuitive solution taking shape would either save countless American lives or be dismissed as the desperate fantasy of an officer stretched to breaking point by combat stress. May 14, 1942, Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego. The morning sun glinted off the metal tools on Thatcher's desk as he finalized his new idea. After weeks of moving matchsticks around, he had found something that might work. He called it the beam defense maneuver, though pilots would later name it the Thatch weave. Thatch drew a simple picture showing 2 F-4F Wildcats flying side by side, 200 yards apart. This was much wider than normal formations. When a Zero attacked one Wildcat from behind, instead of turning in the same direction as the Zero, the pilot would do something that seemed crazy. He would turn toward his partner. The second Wildcat would do the same, turning toward the first. The 2 American planes would fly toward each other, crossing paths. The Zero, following the first Wildcat, would suddenly find itself flying straight into the guns of the second Wildcat, coming from the opposite direction. "This breaks all the old rules," Thatch explained to Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare, who stared at the diagram with wide eyes. "We don't try to outturn the Zero anymore. Instead, we make the Zero fly into our trap." The beauty of the tactic was in its simplicity. It required just 2 things American pilots could do better than Zero pilots: roll quickly and fly in perfect formation. When a Wildcat rolled from level to upside-down flight, it took only 1.5 seconds, much faster than the Zero's 2.25 seconds. This quick roll let the Wildcat change direction suddenly. The tactic worked like this. 2 pairs of Wildcats would fly in a loose formation. Each pair would weave back and forth, crossing paths regularly. If a Zero got on the tail of any Wildcat, that pilot would turn toward his teammate. As they crossed paths, the teammate would have a perfect shot at the pursuing Zero. "It's like a deadly dance," O'Hare said, moving his hands to show the crossing pattern. "The Zero thinks it's catching us, but really it's flying into a trap." Many pilots didn't believe it would work. Lieutenant Commander Paul Ramsey shook his head during the first briefing. "You want us to fly toward the enemy? That goes against everything we've been taught." Thatch understood their doubts. Every pilot had been trained to turn away from danger. Turning toward another plane seemed like suicide. But the math worked. If a Zero was chasing a Wildcat at 300 mph and the second Wildcat was coming head-on at 300 mph, the Zero pilot would have less than half a second to see the threat and react. The first test flights happened on May 20th. 8 Wildcats took off from North Island, split into 2 groups, and practiced the weaving pattern at 15,000 feet. At first, they kept the pattern loose, with planes crossing paths at distances of 1,000 feet. As they gained confidence, they tightened the formation to just 500 feet. "Keep your eyes on your partner, not on the enemy," Thatch called over the radio as they practiced. "Trust the pattern. The enemy will be there when you need him to be." The pilots found that timing was everything. The weave had to happen at just the right speed, not too fast, not too slow. They settled on crossing paths every 20 seconds. This gave enough time to spot a pursuing Zero and call for help, but wasn't so slow that the Zero could break off its attack. By May 26th, the squadron had practiced the weave for over 30 flight hours. Thatch varied the scenarios, sometimes putting his best pilots in the role of Zeros to test how the tactic held up against smart enemies. Even when the enemy knew what was coming, the weave worked. The physics was simple but powerful. A Zero trying to follow a Wildcat through the weave pattern would need to make tighter turns than its American prey. This would slow the Zero down, making it an easier target. And if the Zero tried to cut across the pattern to save time, it would fly directly into the guns of the crossing Wildcat. On May 28th, orders came through. Thatch's squadron was to deploy immediately to the USS Yorktown. Intelligence reports suggested a major Japanese operation targeting Midway Atoll. The new tactic would be tested in actual combat far sooner than anyone expected. As the pilots packed their gear, Thatch made one final note in his tactical journal. "This isn't about proving a theory anymore. It's about keeping my men alive against the deadliest fighter in the Pacific. God help us if I'm wrong." June 4th, 1942. 06:15 hours, 25 miles northeast of Midway Atoll. The first rays of dawn illuminated Lieutenant Commander Thatch's F-4F Wildcat as he led Fighting Squadron 3, VF-3, on combat air patrol. His flight of 6 F-4Fs cruised at 20,000 feet, scanning for Japanese aircraft approaching the American carrier USS Yorktown. The air tasted metallic through his oxygen mask as tension tightened his chest. Intelligence reports had confirmed a massive Japanese carrier force was approaching, intent on capturing Midway as a stepping stone toward Hawaii. Thatcher's earphones crackled with the voice of Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey reporting enemy carriers spotted 180 miles northwest. Moments later, radar operators aboard Yorktown detected incoming aircraft approaching from the west. Thatch banked his formation toward the threat, knowing his untested tactic would face its trial by fire within minutes. At 06:25, Lieutenant Samuel Adams spotted them first, tiny black specks against the cloud layer at 12,000 feet. 36 torpedo bombers from the Japanese carriers, Hiryu and Soryu, escorted by Zero fighters of the elite Tainan Air Group. The Japanese pilots were veterans of campaigns across China and Southeast Asia, with hundreds of combat sorties and dozens of kills each. "Zeros at 1 o'clock high," Thatch called over the radio. "Remember the weave! Stay with your wingman!" He rolled his Wildcat into a shallow dive, building airspeed to 280 knots while maintaining altitude advantage. His wingman, Ensign R.A.M. Dibb, maintained perfect position 200 yards off his right wing. The first Zero, piloted by Petty Officer Shigeru Itaya, peeled away from the bomber escort and climbed toward Thatcher's section. 2 more Zeros followed. Itaya was a combat veteran with 16 confirmed victories, most against outclassed P-40s in the Philippines. His logbook, recovered after the war, would reveal his confidence in engaging the American fighters. Wildcats sighted. Easy prey for experienced pilots. As the distance closed to 800 yards, Thatch observed the Zero's approach angle and made his decision. "Execute weave! Now!" he called over the radio. Instead of turning away from the threat as every combat instinct demanded, Thatch rolled his F-4F 90 degrees and pulled into a sharp turn, directly toward his wingman. Ensign Dibb mirrored the maneuver precisely. The Japanese pilots had never seen this tactic. Itaya followed Thatch's Wildcat through the turn, his Zero's superior maneuverability allowing him to cut inside Thatch's arc. For 3 critical seconds, Itaya believed he was seconds from adding another victory to his record. Then the geometry of the weave revealed its lethal elegance. As the 2 Wildcats crossed paths at a combined closing speed of 560 mph, Ensign Dibb had a perfect deflection shot at Itaya's Zero. 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns erupted, each firing at 750 rounds per minute, sending 75 armor-piercing rounds directly into the Zero's unarmored cockpit and fuel tank. The lightweight fighter, with no self-sealing tanks or pilot protection, erupted into flames and disintegrated. The remaining Zeros broke formation, momentarily confused by the unexpected tactic. Lieutenant Brainerd T. Macomber, flying the second element with Ensign Marks, executed the same weave pattern when two Zeros attacked his section. The Japanese pilots, attempting to coordinate their attack, flew directly into the guns of the crossing Wildcats. Macomber's gun camera footage, analysed after the battle, showed 18 direct hits on a Zero flown by Petty Officer Sakai, which subsequently rolled inverted and dove away trailing smoke. For the next 8 minutes, Thatch's 6 Wildcats engaged 15 Zeros in a swirling combat above the torpedo bombers. Each time a Zero manoeuvred onto a Wildcat's tail, the American pilot would turn toward his wingman, creating the weaving pattern that transformed the Zero's superior turning ability into a deadly liability. 4 Zeros were confirmed destroyed, with 3 more probably destroyed and 6 damaged. Most significantly, only 1 Wildcat was lost. Lieutenant Macomber's aircraft took a 20mm cannon shell in the engine after he became separated from his wingman. The kill ratio of 4:1 represented a complete reversal of previous combat results, where Japanese pilots had enjoyed 12.1 or 13.1 advantages. As the combat subsided, Thatch rejoined his surviving pilots and led them back toward the Yorktown. His tactical doctrine had not merely been validated, it had revolutionized fighter combat in a single engagement. Radio traffic from other American squadrons already contained urgent requests for details on the Thatch weave as surviving pilots described its effectiveness. Commander John W. Raby, air officer aboard USS Enterprise, documented the immediate impact. Thatch's defensive weave provided our fighter pilots with the first effective counter to the Zero. Within hours of the Midway engagement, all fighter squadrons were requesting briefings on the tactic. It transformed our pilots from defensive prey to offensive hunters. July 15, 1942. Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida. Commander John S.A. Thatch stood before 200 fighter instructors in the main briefing room, his combat-worn khakis contrasting with the pristine uniforms of pilots who had yet to face enemy fire. A large chalkboard behind him displayed the weaving pattern that had saved his squadron at Midway. Within 6 weeks of that pivotal battle, the tactical revolution had been formalized into official doctrine through Naval Aviation Tactical Directive 2142, classified secret and distributed to every fighter squadron in the Pacific. "Gentlemen, forget everything you know about dogfighting," Thatch began. "The Zero will outturn our best pilots in our best aircraft every time. Our survival depends on never engaging in the horizontal turning contest the Japanese expect." For the next 3 hours, he methodically detailed the mechanics of the weave, using gun camera footage from Midway to illustrate its effectiveness. The tactical doctrine spread through American forces with unprecedented speed. By September 1942, the Army Air Forces had adopted modified versions for their P-38 Lightning and P-40 Warhawk squadrons operating from Guadalcanal and New Guinea. Major Richard Bong, who would become America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, credited the weave with his squadron's survival during the desperate early days at Henderson Field. "Before we learned the weave, we were losing 3 pilots for every Japanese pilot shot down," Bong noted in his combat journal. "After implementing Thatcher's system, we achieved parity, then superiority. The 49th Fighter Group's kill ratio improved from 0.8.1 in June 1942 to 4.1.1 by December, despite flying the supposedly outclassed P-40. The weave required intense training and absolute discipline. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley, who formalized the training program at NAS San Diego, established precise parameters. Pairs of fighters would maintain 250, 300-yard separation, execute 45-degree turns when called, and cross at altitudes differing by no more than 100 feet. Training accidents during early implementation claimed 4 aircraft and 2 pilots before standardized procedures were perfected. By early 1943, the tactic had evolved into more complex formations. Commander Paul Ramsey developed the Thatch Weave Diamond, using 4 aircraft instead of 2, creating overlapping fields of defensive fire that made attacking Zeros vulnerable from multiple angles simultaneously. The 4-plane variation achieved a remarkable 6.1 kill ratio during engagements over Rabaul in February 1943. Japanese pilots struggled to counter the American innovation. Captured documents from the 204th Air Group revealed their increasing frustration. American pilots refuse to dogfight as we expect. They maintain wide formations and turn toward each other when attacked. This creates deadly crossfire situations that have cost us many experienced pilots. Lieutenant Minoru Genda, tactical genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack, developed a potential counter-tactic in April 1943. Coordinated simultaneous attacks by multiple Zeros from different angles. When tested against American formations near Bougainville, however, it resulted in disastrous losses. The weaving American fighters created such complex defensive geometries that even coordinated attacks exposed at least 1 Japanese aircraft to defensive fire. The psychological impact proved as significant as the tactical advantage. Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's highest scoring ace with 34 victories, later explained, "Before the weave, our pilots feared the Zero's maneuverability. After learning Thatch's tactic, they gained confidence that transformed them from hunted to hunters. As newer American fighters entered service, the F-6F Hellcat, F-4U Corsair, and P-38 Lightning, the weave remained standard doctrine despite their improved performance." Tactical analysts noted that even with superior aircraft, disciplined formation flying and mutual protection increased survival rates by approximately 60% compared to individual engagements. By mid-1944, the transformation was complete. Combat reports from the Philippine Sea engagement, later dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, documented F-6F Hellcats using modified weave tactics to achieve the most lopsided victory of the Pacific War. 369 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 29 American losses. Admiral Chester Nimitz, in a confidential assessment to the Joint Chiefs of Staff dated August 1944, identified Thatch's tactical innovation as one of the 3 most significant contributions to victory in the Pacific, alongside code breaking and the introduction of proximity fuses. "The weave," Nimitz wrote, "transformed our fighter operations from a defensive liability to an offensive strength at precisely the moment when defeat in the air would have meant strategic catastrophe. Had Midway's outcome been different, Hawaii itself might have been vulnerable." Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the combined effects of material losses and tactical disadvantage. As veteran pilots perished, replacements trained with decreasing fuel allocations faced American pilots executing perfectly coordinated defensive weaves that neutralized the Zero's turning ability, the one advantage Japan's fighters maintained until the war's end. August 15, 1945. Naval Air Station, Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii. The static-filled radio transmission announcing Japan's surrender echoed through the briefing room where Lieutenant Commander John Thatch stood before the newest class of fighter pilots. The statistical evidence of American air superiority spread across the chalkboard behind him. 6,805 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 1,514 American fighters lost in combat operations across the Pacific Theater from June 1942 to August 1945. A kill ratio of 3.97.1 overall, with carrier-based units achieving 4.5.1 and land-based Marine squadrons peaking at 5.1.1 during the Okinawa campaign. These numbers represented a complete reversal from the desperate days of early 1942, when American pilots faced near-certain death against Zero fighters. The transformation began with a simple tactical innovation that contradicted centuries of combat doctrine. When threatened, turn toward your wingman, not away. Victory in the air made everything else possible, Admiral Chester Nimitz would later write in his classified after-action report to the Joint Chiefs. Without air superiority, our island-hopping strategy would have failed. Without the tactical revolution pioneered by Commander Thach, that air superiority might never have been achieved. The core principles of the Thach Weave, mutual support, positional awareness, and exploiting the enemy's strengths against them, influenced every aspect of American fighter doctrine for decades afterward. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, F-86 Sabre pilots facing nimble MiG-15s employed modified weaving tactics at jet speeds exceeding 600 mm, achieving an 8.1 kill ratio despite the MiG's superior turning capability at certain altitudes. Captain James Jabara, America's first jet ace with 15 victories in Korea, credited his survival to lessons learned from Thach's innovation. The principles remain identical, Jabara explained in a 1953 tactical assessment. Never fight the enemy's fight. When he expects you to turn away, turn toward your wingman instead. Discipline beats individual brilliance. Formation integrity trumps personal glory. The influence extended beyond American borders. Royal Navy Lieutenant Commander Richard Cork, who observed Thach's tactics firsthand while aboard USS Enterprise in 1943, imported the weave to British carrier operations in 1944. The Fleet Air Arm achieved remarkable success against German aircraft over Norway using these techniques, prompting Air Vice Marshal Sir Keith Park to comment, "The Americans have finally improved upon what the RAF learned in the Battle of Britain. Mutual protection is everything in fighter combat." Former Japanese pilots provided the most telling testimonials during post-war interviews. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the first wave attack on Pearl Harbor, described the psychological impact. When American fighters began using the weaving tactic, it created confusion among our pilots. The Zero's turning ability, our greatest advantage, became irrelevant. Pursuing an American fighter meant flying into the guns of his wingman. It was like striking at a snake only to be bitten by another you did not see. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who survived the war with 64 victories, offered technical insight. The Americans identified our weakness, the Zero's slower roll rate, and built a tactic that exploited it perfectly. We tried developing counters, but none worked consistently. By 1944, our newer pilots were terrified of engaging American formations. The revolution in aerial tactics eventually transformed the physical design of fighter aircraft themselves. Post-war American designs like the F-86 Sabre, F-100 Super Sabre, and later the F-4 Phantom emphasized roll rate, acceleration, and energy retention rather than turning performance. These characteristics better supported mutual defense tactics derived from Thach's original concept. When Thach's former wingman, Edward Butch O'Hare, became the Navy's first Ace and Medal of Honor recipient, he emphasized the importance of the weaving tactic in his combat success. After O'Hare's death in combat in November 1943, Chicago's Orchard Depot Airport was renamed O'Hare International Airport in his honor. Today, millions of travelers pass through this memorial to a pilot whose success was built upon Thach's tactical innovation. Thach himself continued shaping naval aviation after the war, eventually rising to the rank of admiral. His career spanned the transition from propeller-driven fighters to supersonic jets, but his fundamental insight remained valid across technological generations. Tactics matter more than technology. In his final address to the Naval War College in 1967, Thach summarized the lesson that had saved countless lives. "We did not build a better fighter to defeat the Zero. We built a better tactic. When conventional wisdom said turn away from danger, we turned toward our wingman instead. When tradition dictated that pilots fight as individuals, we emphasized mutual support above all else. The weave worked because it transformed the Zero's greatest strength into a vulnerability. The principles established in those desperate months of 1942 remain embedded in modern fighter doctrine. Today's F-22 and F-35 pilots still train in mutual support tactics that can be traced directly to matchsticks moved across a desk aboard USS Lexington. The lesson transcends aviation. When facing a superior opponent, victory comes not from matching their strength, but from fundamental tactical innovation that changes the nature of the contest itself.